Okay, so welcome everyone to the June forecast. We're beginning to sense, I'm sure you're sensing it, things are starting to heat up in June, especially by the end of June. And we're heading into a really, what I think is going to be a really hot summer in every sense of the word. It's going to be a very explosive, highly volatile summer. But there is also, thankfully, a period we're heading into now, especially from the end of this month into July, where all of the visible planets are lining up in their own signs. And so it's going to also be a very powerful time. So though it might be explosive in some areas and for some people, it's also going to be very productive. And I think that we have to make the most of all of these transits, because this is what I've been referring to for a while now, really the sweet spot of the year, especially once Venus moves into Taurus by mid-month. By the end of the month, then Mars moves into Aries, and we have all of the 5 visible planets and representing the 5 great elements in great strength, working really well. And apart from a few technical issues, some complexities, they are really strong. So if we cannot make the most of these kinds of transits at this time, then when the hell are we going to be able to make the most of transits? So I think we really need to be mindful of this and make use of them, whatever you've got going on in your own life. Anyway, we'll go through this as we go through the month. So let me bring up the slides. But first, let's just chant for Ganesh 3 times. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. Om Gang Ganapatiye Namah. For those that don't know this park really in Ireland, it's in County Wicklow, about an hour drive south of Dublin. This is it used to be called Victoria's Way, and now it's called Victor's Way. So this is one of the granite statues, massive Ganesh statues, and one of many, and a whole experience. If you're ever in Wicklow in Ireland, you could visit this park, Victor's Way. Always want to mention this because it's important to put this in context, that when I'm talking about June, I'm talking about the transits only, and that is just the superficial layer. It's not really going to get down into the meat and bones of what you're experiencing, which is predominantly your dashas, as they're called in Indian astrology, the planetary and sign-based cycles that you're experiencing, as well as your own birth chart, of course, because, you know, transits, we can talk about transits to the cows come home, but it's so, though universally felt, it trickles down into your individual experience so uniquely that we cannot, in a kind of general format like this, express that unique experience for you unless you're having a one-on-one. So always remember your dashas, the cycles you're in, your unique birth chart, and of course, where you live. That's going to have an impact. And just a reminder that some people who might be watching this playback on YouTube, that I use the sidereal calculations. It doesn't mean that I don't consider the tropical. It's just as a practice, I use sidereal. And another thing you could do, for those who are a bit more advanced in Indian astrology studies, you could also add the lunar mansion or nakshatras, or what I call just moon sign. And you can look at the transits from your moon sign, and there are 27 of them, but they go in cycles of 3. So there are 3 cycles of 9. And these are the 9 different cycles. And so this is counted more so from your moon itself. So that is the first one. So you take the moon, your moon, and the lunar mansion your moon is in as the first one. And you look at the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, all the way up to the 9th from there. But there are 3 rounds of that. And I'll show you how that looks in the chart now as well. And you can see how do the transits in these particular lunar mansions that I'll mention, just a few, maybe of Saturn, Rahu, which has just changed, and how does it affect your moon sign? So the way you do it is simply that it runs in this order: Ketu, the south node; Venus, Sun, Moon, Mars; Rahu, the north node; Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury. These are the 9 planets or grahas. And so they correspond to these 9 different cycles. And these are words that I've used. I mean, some use other words. I kind of maybe diluted these words down a bit. So for example, 7th is the Death Star, literally called the Death Star. And of course, we only die once. So there's no point scaring anyone using the word death. We'll just use the word change. and it represents a big change in a person's life usually. Likewise, the third and the fifth, again, I've diluted these words down. Pause, struggle is another word that's used, or the fifth, work. Obstacle is another word that's used. But they challenge us. These are the three: third, fifth, and seventh. So if you have planets transiting those lunar mansions from your moon, then they might challenge you. And they challenge you to change direction in life more than anything. It's not like it's for nothing. It's for you to return to your dharma, as it's called. You can read all about this concept as well in Andrew Foss's book, Yoga of the Planets. He writes really succinctly about this, sense of how these 3, 5th, and 7th are the dharmic cycles. So apart from the cycles themselves, which you start with the first one, of course, where the moon is when you're born, and then you have the next, and so on and so on. But the transits also impact these ongoing. So, for example, if you were born, and these are all the 27 lunar mansions that correspond to each of the 9 planets. Say, for example, you were born with Shatavishak, lunar mansion, then you were born in a Rahu cycle for the first part of your life, and then it went to Jupiter, and then to Saturn and Mercury, and so on. If you were born with Shravana, you started with the moon, and then Mars and Rahu, and so on. But taking Shravana as an example, that is related to the moon. If you want to know how the Saturn transit currently in Dhanishta, as I'll talk about, is affecting you, then it's second from there. Because if you were born with Shravana, which is the moon, Saturn is currently in Dhanishta, which is Mars. That's 1, 2, 1, 2. So that's second one here. So it's all about growth. So you can work it out that way. It's a bit more of an advanced technique, and I'm sure that if you're watching this live with me, you can ask questions after. If you're watching a playback, then you can message me or comment, and if I can answer, I will answer, of course. And so talking about Saturn, and where we're starting now into the retrogrades, all of the slower moving planets, Saturn, Jupiter, all the outer planets start. Pluto has already started. Neptune will by the end of the month, and Saturn has just stationed. And it's stationed retrograde, and it's in sidereal Aquarius, the 1st degree, or just past the 1st degree, but it will go back to the beginning of Capricorn, and all within this lunar mansion, Dhanishta. So it's very much about the theme of pulling things together, and very many components coming together to build something. And of course, Saturn retrograde means that it's about rebuilding something. So this will be a theme ongoing for the next few months. As it stations, as it is this month, it really feels like the whole month is a station in a way. And because when we add the solstice on the 21st, which itself means stand still, it's a peak period of the year, but it's also like this kind of sense of standstill when we add this Saturn retrograde. So you might find that you need to maybe just take a pause at this time of the year in June. And in relation to Saturn type themes, to really, I guess, recalibrate your long-term goals and your objectives. Because it's doing it in its own signs, it's very strong. But of course, all retrograde planets, though strong, are quite complex. They don't express themselves very clearly. But the best way to express all retrogrades, whether it's Mercury retrograde or Saturn retrograde, is to go back over something. And then you got the wind at your back. So you basically make the most of it by going back and doing something perhaps that you used to do in your past that gave you peace, or going back to a discipline that you used to have in your life with Saturn retrograde, or going back over something and deciding that maybe I overcommitted there, and maybe I need to sort of pull back here because I cannot continue to do that. One of the problems with Saturn, or any planet retrograde, but with Saturn, it's about work especially, is taking on too much and then being exhausted. So retrograde planets have this kind of all or nothing approach. So if you can slow down and, try and get more balance in doing what you must every day, doing a little bit every day is better than doing a load in one day and then not being able to do anything the next day, sort of thing. But of course, in its extreme, Saturn retrograde, especially in a birth chart, will show somebody who's a workaholic and then who has to take career breaks because they're exhausted. So then by the end of the month as well, so now we have Pluto, Saturn, and then we add Neptune. another outer planet. Of course, the others will follow suit in the months to come, in Jupiter and all of the rest. But Neptune retrograde is a bit trickier because it's very diffuse and confusing anyway. And when you place it retrograde, especially in this division of the zodiac, in this Purva Bhadrapada, the section between Aquarius and Pisces, the Pegasus constellation, it's very confusing anyway. And you put Neptune into it and then retrograde, and it's sort of like, you know, what's going on here? It's a bit confusing. So just to be mindful of that from the end of June and for the next few months as well, in terms of returning to themes of Aquarius as well, where, you know, we've gone into Pisces and we've sensed the possibility and the sort of idealism and dreamlike state and the potentiality, I guess, of Pisces. But we're having to go back to Aquarius one last time. It's the very last time, because Neptune will return to Pisces next year, having returned to Aquarius in September, and it will stay in Pisces for the next 14 years. So this is a big deal, you know, every time Neptune moves signs. And just like Saturn, it's returning to a sign it's already left. So there's unfinished business this year, at the end of this year. And that can play out in so many ways, of course, individually, but generally we can say the themes of going back to Aquarius, social issues in terms of humanitarian things and bigger social issues, I would say. You know, we can't, you know, dream the dream as such yet until we have dealt with the problems around, well, society, bigger problems. But again, it's more practical to look at it in terms of your own chart, in terms of the house position of Aquarius and what needs to be returned to. For one last, perhaps, look at your dreams, I would say, and are they realistic? And if they are possible, Saturn, which subsequently returns to Aquarius, of course, next year, as Neptune moves out next year, will then set things in motion. So whatever you've got going on in Aquarius, in other words, is going to be set in motion in the next few years. And this last return of Neptune to Aquarius by the end of this year is sort of like this last sort of, let's dream this dream. Okay, so the other thing that happens, of course, is that Rahu and Ketu, the two nodes, always move retrograde. So all the other planets joining them means that, you know, they're kind of getting in line with the nodes. But Rahu, always retrograde, has moved now back into Bharani, or will move into Bharani in June. And so by mid-June until February next year, we have Rahu in Bharani. Now, one good thing about that, well, there's always good and bad for everything. And I know we shouldn't talk about black and white language, but, you know, we always have to call a spade, I guess, and then work from there. Rahu in Kritika has not been good for supply chains. That's been quite obvious. Kritika is all about energy, and Rahu disturbs the flow. Big boom and bust kind of situations going on with Rahu. So the fact that it's leaving Kritika by this month, the supply chains can start to recover in some way. And it might take a long time, but Rahu has been very disruptive to Kritika in the last few months, especially, you know, the energy crisis and all of that, the energy bills. So now that it's moving to Bharani, well, Bharani is ruled by Yama, the god of death. And, you know, this is actually said to be the birthplace of Rahu in myth. So there's a connection here, obviously, with Yama and Rahu, and they've both been very sort of, quote unquote, the darker qualities. But in another sense, it's what gives life. I mean, literally, Bharani is the birthing process. So Rahu in Bharani and being born in Bharani itself is really sort of conducive to making things happen, birthing something, creating something. We just have to be mindful of the pitfalls of Rahu always in any sign it's in any lunar mansion, and the disturbance that can be created in the mind, especially psychologically, more so with Rahu, where we might be so gung-ho about something and so eager to make something happen that we create chaos. And I think my sense is that it could really get really volatile. But personally, again, we have to draw that into our being and understand how can we personally make the most of this. So by being productive, that's one way, but without being chaotic and disorganized, we have to channel Jupiter in some way to antidote this quality of Rahu, which is basically being more organized, so that whatever creative impulse we have, and as exciting as a very disturbed, chaotic creative impulse is, and how genius sometimes can spring from that, it can often be so hard to actually channel that into, into very productive means when it's all over the place. So just be mindful of that, I would say, for the rest of the year. And then here we go with the sweet spot again, like I was talking about, that the planets are now moving into Taurus. And again, if you're watching this and you're used to tropical zodiac, I am referring to sidereal, the fixed stars, more in alignment with the actual constellations. So we have the sun having, moved through here for the first or the last couple of weeks of May and the first couple of weeks of June. And then by mid-June, by the 18th of June, we have Venus move into Taurus. So this is a real sweet spot, because at this stage and into July, like I said, all of the 5 visible planets are in their own signs. And I'll show you what that looks like in an image now. But if you want to read this article that I wrote about it on my website here, about planets in Taurus and what Taurus is all about and how important Taurus is for our stability and well-being, you can read about it here on the website Planets in Taurus. It's the last article I wrote. So it is a sweet spot, and we really, if we cannot enjoy this, then what can we enjoy? This is really where we get out, we get into the garden if we're lucky to have a garden, or we just get out into the park or into nature if we're even luckier to live in the countryside, and just enjoy nature's bounty. And that's what Venus and Taurus is all about. It's all about sensual pleasure as well, and good food and good company and being in our community and family surrounding us, all of the basics. And the arts. One of the key things about Venus, of course, is the arts. So the other thing to say is that we have the solstice, which is this kind of standstill point, this peak point, whether it's winter or summer for you. And for most on the planet, it's summer. On the 21st. And again, this is just a time to notice that shift, and the sun literally changing direction in the sky, going from northerly to southerly or southerly to northerly, depending where you are on the planet. So just noticing that shift, I would say. And this is the lineup after the solstice as the moon joins them. So you basically have Mercury moving into its own sign, Gemini, by beginning of July. You have Venus having moved into Taurus the end of June. Moon will actually move into Cancer as well later on, but here it is lining up with all these planets. Mars is moving into Aries a few days after this on the 27th. Jupiter is in its own sign already, Pisces, you see here. And then Saturn is in its own sign, Aquarius, though moving back to Capricorn. So they're all in their own signs. So all the elements are working really well. And again, as long as you're mindful of the complexity of Saturn retrograde and having to rework something, and also of Mars and its kind of more volatile quality in Aries as it moves in and joins Uranus and Rahu. I'll talk more about that now in a minute. Then you can really channel this in a really productive manner to make a lot happen in the next few weeks. So I would encourage you to do so, just to be mindful though of that kind of potential volatility. And that volatility could really, really get out of hand this month. And I know this is a bit like, well, why are you bringing up this now? What about this sweet spot in the year? And I kind of almost feel like, well, when things are going well in many ways, that's a good time to actually bring up the potential problems. Because when there's so many problems, you don't want to hear about more that we could add. So in terms of the more immediate time frame, it can really set things off in a big way. Now, I don't know if that means setting them off in what's already been set off in Ukraine, for example, or if it's something new set off, like in China and the Taiwan situation, or if it's other things. It could be other things. Now, it's likely also to be many wildfires and all of that. That's kind of more obvious. But it could be explosive events otherwise, and natural disasters apart from man-made, and attacks, more attacks, and more a sense of angst in general when you look at the astrology. Anyway, let's not dwell too much on it now. Let's talk about the moon phases in June. We have the full moon on the 14th and another new moon by the end of the month on the 29th. The full moon on the 14th is what they call a super moon. So it just means it appears closer because of the orbits of the moon. And then the new moon on the 29th. So let's look at both of these charts. So this is on the left, the full moon in Jeshta, the lunar mansion at the very end of Scorpio. Now, last month, So this is the chart. Last month, we already had a full moon at the beginning of Scorpio, the first degree of Scorpio, and it was a total lunar eclipse. Now we're having another full moon in Scorpio, and it's at the very last degree of Scorpio. It's not an eclipse, but it's a full moon and at the last degree. So it is more intense because of that, but it could be intensely good. Full moons are generally more enjoyable, but a full moon in Scorpio, there's definitely some emotional volatility there and vulnerability that we need to be mindful of for those couple of days leading up to it. And itself, because it's the last degree of Scorpio moving into Sagittarius, this whole, I guess, struggle and overcoming the struggle of dealing with our earth-based desires, which is what Scorpio is about, and our fears, and moving into Sagittarius into a more high-minded realm. And that's really what the whole journey of Scorpio to Sagittarius is all about. It's about preparing for the worst, Scorpio, and hoping for the best, Sagittarius. And so we might be really feeling this intensely at this point. You can see as well that Venus is conjoined Rahu at this time. And that's another, quite volatile indication in many ways. Despite the strengths, like I said, of, all the planets moving into their strength now after this more so. So I'll show you that. So that's the full moon, just to be mindful of that around mid-month. Then at the end of the month, and we have this waning cycle and the new moon at the end of the month. It's in the middle of Gemini. Again, remember sidereal Gemini, the fixed stars. So if you're thinking, isn't the new moon in Cancer, tropical Cancer? Yes, sidereal Gemini. And this is called Ardra, the lunar mansion Ardra in the middle of Gemini. And it is also, like in a way, the previous lunation, full moon, and Jeshta about overcoming something. Ardra is about clearing something. And that literally can sometimes be, I've seen it a lot in charts of people who have moon in Ardra that are like renovation. They're like renovating houses and things. But it's literally like a clearing emotionally. It's like when you have a good cry. And one of the symbols of Ardra is literally a teardrop and the clarity that tears can bring. But it also suggests in terms of nature, like storms and clear and water and all of that. So that's kind of another thing to be mindful of, I suppose. An emotional reset for sure at the end of June. Now you can see what's happened, that Mars has moved into Aries, very strong. Venus has moved into Taurus, its own sign. Jupiter is in Pisces, its own sign. Saturn in Aquarius. So Mercury is yet to move into Gemini. It will follow this new moon and move into Gemini. And then, so all of these planets, remember that alignment of all the planets are in such a strong position by the end of the month that, again, it's worth taking full advantage of, I would say. And that's the month of June. If you're a follower, you'll know about all my posts. If you're not, consider signing up on Patreon. So it's called patreon.com. You can just search Timeline Astrology. If you could just hit the like button, that would be great. I'd appreciate it. And leave a comment below if you have any questions, and subscribe and all of that good stuff. And thanks for watching. So for those who are here live, I will start taking questions, and for everyone else, until next time.